The protocol was called cascade illumination, and the working assumption behind it, the assumption that had survived 12 years of peer review, 3 separate funding audits, and 1 very public demonstration before the Compact Security Council, was that it would kill anything it hit. That assumption was wrong, but I am getting ahead of myself. My name is Veth Caloran, and at the time of the Cascade trials I was 31 years old and 3 months into my posting at the Osservath Institute for Applied Ordnance Science, which occupied the lower 4 tiers of a research platform anchored above the 4th moon of a gas giant whose name I could not pronounce, and whose gravity was approximately 1.3 times what I had grown up under. I noticed the gravity every morning when I walked the corridor to the primary test floor. My legs were accustomed to it by the 4th week. I stopped noticing it by the 6th. I mention it only because the gravity was one of several data points the Institute's principal researchers had quietly failed to account for in their initial human biology baseline, and I did not know that yet. I was not there as a test subject. That is important to say plainly, because the final incident report and 3 separate subsequent reviews all use language that implies I volunteered. I did not volunteer. I was there as a calibration witness, a human in the room whose physiological baseline readings the Institute's sensors needed for the pretrial system checks, because the Cascade Illumination Array had been designed with compact standard biological sensitivity parameters, and those parameters had been built around what the Institute's chief researcher, a Varethian named Oseth Morvine, called the conventional tissue response profile. I was the conventional tissue response reference. I was, in other words, a measuring instrument, the kind that breathes. Oseth Morvine was brilliant. I want to be clear about that before I say anything else about him, because it would be easy, reading what follows, to conclude that he was careless or arrogant or that he had not thought through what he was building. He had thought through what he was building. He had thought through it more thoroughly than anyone else alive, and the papers he wrote during the Cascade development years are still cited in the literature on directed coherent light weapon systems, and they will be cited long after the events I am describing here have been forgotten by everyone except the 7 of us who were in the observation gallery that morning. What Oseth Morvine had not thought through was humans. This was not unusual. Very few people had thought through humans at that point. We had been in the Compact for 11 years, which is not very long when you are dealing with civilizations that measure their institutional memory in centuries, and the available literature on human physiological parameters was thin, recent. And this is the part that matters, almost entirely assembled from observation of humans under compact standard environmental conditions. Nobody had gone back to look at where we came from. Nobody had gone back to look at what had made us. Oseth Morvine had a file on human biology. I read it later. It was 16 pages, and it was accurate as far as it went, and it went as far as the 11 years of compact-adjacent data collection covered. It said that humans were a Class II biological entity, carbon-based, with standard protein architecture, standard cellular repair mechanisms, and a light absorption spectrum that was. And this is the specific phrase that comes back to me when I think about those months, broadly consistent with compact median parameters, with minor melanin-driven variants at the surface layers. Minor melanin-driven variants. I will come back to that. The Osservath Institute occupied space that had been carved out of the platform's lower tiers over decades of incremental expansion, the way research facilities tend to grow. One wing added when a grant came through, another when a project demanded space, a third when the administration changed, and the new director wanted to stamp the place with something physical and permanent. I had walked all 4 tiers in my first week, not because anyone had asked me to, but because it was something I did in new environments. Know the building, know where everything is, know which corridors connect to which and how long it takes to get from one end to the other at a brisk walk versus a careful one. The primary test floor, occupied the entirety of Tier 1. The Cascade Illumination Array's emitter assembly was a curved wall of crystalline focusing elements, each the size of a door, arranged in a progressive arc designed to concentrate and align the coherent light output from 47 individual emitter modules into a single coherent beam. The beam, at full output, had a theoretical energy density per square centimeter at the focal point that was, in the terminology the Institute's documentation used, sufficient to achieve instantaneous structural compromise of any known biological substrate at engagement ranges up to 400 meters. The documentation had a specific table for this. I read the table during my second day on the platform. It listed the structural compromise time in milliseconds for 17 different species categories. The longest time on the table was 340 milliseconds. That was for the Kether, who are the most physically robust species in the compact, and who are also, as I had recently learned from the story of a colleague's qualification experience, considered somewhat extreme even by Deathworlder standards. 340 milliseconds for the Kether. The table did not have a row for humans. There was a footnote. The footnote said, "Human baseline estimated at Class 2 median. See Supplementary Note B7." I found Supplementary Note B7. It said the human structural compromise estimate was 80 to 120 milliseconds based on Class 2 median parameters. I read that footnote, and I noted it, and I filed it in the part of my mind where I keep things I intend to think about later. And then I went back to my calibration duties and my gravity-adjusted morning walks and my 3 months of being a measuring instrument that breathed. My calibration duties were straightforward. 3 times a week I reported to Orvith Sass, who was Osith Morvin's senior junior researcher, and whose specialty was biological sensor calibration, and I sat in a chair and allowed her to run the Institute's biosensor array against my body for 40 minutes while the system logged baseline readings. Heart rate, respiratory rate, skin conductance, core temperature, surface temperature at 17 points, blood pressure, neurological baseline, and a suite of more exotic measurements that I did not fully understand, and that Orvith Sass explained to me in detail because she assumed I wanted to understand them. I did want to understand them. I asked good questions. By the end of the second month, Orvith Sass and I had a professional relationship that was not exactly warm but was efficient and mutually respectful, which is the kind of professional relationship I find most comfortable. The other personnel on the platform were, in the main, people who did not pay a great deal of attention to me. This is common, I have found, when humans are in spaces that were not designed around human presence. You become background, part of the environmental data, noted in the sensor logs but not otherwise remarked upon. The Tarvani technicians who staffed the test floor on the lower shift were efficient and incurious. The Varethian administrative staff on Tier 3 were polite in the formal register their species uses in professional contexts, which does not require or expect warmth. The platform's one canteen offered food that was calibrated to compact standard nutritional guidelines and tasted of nothing in particular, which was why I had brought the tea. I also spent a considerable amount of my time reading. The Institute had a documentation library that was comprehensive and accessible to all personnel at my clearance level, and I read through it systematically during the months before the trials. Not because I was required to. Because the building I was in was designed to test the limits of what living things could withstand, and I was one of the living things in it, and knowing the documentation seemed like a reasonable precaution. The Cascade trials were scheduled in 4 phases, each phase separated by a minimum cooling period for the emitter assembly. Phase 1 was a materials test, inert substrate samples at graduated engagement ranges, to verify beam coherence and focal accuracy. Phase 2 was a biological materials test, using cell culture substrates representative of each of the 17 species categories in the table I had read. Phase 3 was the live calibration trial, which was the phase that required my presence as a reference datum, and which involved exposing a defined surface area of my forearm to the beam at a graduated power setting starting at 5% of the full output level, and stepping up in increments of 5% until the Institute's biosensors registered the first tissue response signal. This was the protocol. I had read it. I had signed the acknowledgement form, which was not a consent form. It was a form acknowledging that I had received and understood the trial parameters. There is a distinction. The distinction mattered later, during the reviews, and I will let the reviews speak for themselves on that point. Phase 1 ran cleanly. I watched it from the observation gallery on the second tier above the test floor, standing alongside Asif Morvin's two junior researchers, a Tarvani named Orvith Sass and a hegemony affiliate named Kel, who communicated primarily in written notation and smelled faintly of ionized copper. The material's samples dissolved on schedule. The coherence readings were within tolerance. Asif Morvin stood at the primary monitoring console and said nothing, which was, I had learned, how he expressed satisfaction. He had 3 modes of expression: silence for satisfaction, a single quiet note on the documentation tablet for concern, and a sustained focused stillness for genuine uncertainty. In 3 months I had seen satisfaction most often, concern occasionally, and sustained focused stillness twice. Once when the Phase 1 coherence readings drifted outside tolerance in the 7th test and had to be corrected, and once when he had read the pre-publication summary of a competitor's paper that arrived during the 2nd month and sat with it for 40 minutes before setting it down and returning to work. Phase 2 also ran cleanly. The cell culture substrates registered response times that matched the table's predictions within acceptable margins. The Ket-IR substrate took 318 milliseconds, which was 22 milliseconds faster than the table's estimate, and Asif Morvin made a note. The Class 2 substrates, the category my footnote had placed me in, registered at 94 milliseconds on average, which sat comfortably within the 80 to 120 estimate. Asif Morvin made another note. Orvith Sass ran the data against the predictive model and told the room that Phase 2 had validated the model's accuracy to within 3.7%. Kel wrote something in notation that Orvith Sass read and then looked briefly at me and then looked away. I noticed that. I did not say anything about it. Phase 3 was scheduled for the following morning. I spent that evening in my quarters reading the Phase 3 protocol documentation, which I had already read twice, but which I read again because reading documentation twice is what I do when something is bothering me and I cannot identify what it is. The protocol specified that the live calibration trial would use a 7 centimeter square exposure window on the dorsal surface of my left forearm, isolated by a shaped shield that would block exposure to all other body surfaces. The beam would be attenuated to 5% of full output for the first exposure, with each subsequent step adding 5%, and between each step the biosensors would check for tissue response, and the trial would end when a response was registered. 5% of full output was still, if my reading of the Phase 2 data was correct, approximately the energy equivalent of what the Class 2 cell culture substrates had registered response at. The Phase 2 substrates had gone at 94 milliseconds. The protocol documentation noted, in a paragraph I had skimmed the first 2 times and read carefully the third, that the step-up sequence was designed to accommodate variance in individual response parameters while maintaining trial efficiency, and that exposure duration at each power level will not exceed 2 seconds before step-up. 2 seconds, at 5% of full output, against a 7 centimeter square patch of my forearm. I read that paragraph 3 times. Then I got up and made tea. I had brought a quantity of good earth tea because I was going to be on the platform for 6 months, and I was not going to drink what they had. and I stood at my quarter's single viewport looking out at the gas giant's banded atmosphere and thought about melanin. Melanin is a biological pigment. Most humans have it in varying concentrations and distributions, primarily in the skin, the hair, and the iris. It does several things, melanin. It provides coloration. It scavenges free radicals, and it absorbs ultraviolet radiation with a very high efficiency and converts that radiation into heat, which the skin then dissipates. This is an old mechanism. It evolved on a planet whose sun outputs a significant fraction of its energy in UV frequencies, on a surface with a variable atmospheric UV filter, and a 4.5 billion year history of irradiating things. The melanin pathway is not a secondary defense mechanism. It is not a workaround or an adaptation or a patch applied late in the design. It is a fundamental biological infrastructure that is old enough to predate the genus it currently lives in. I am not a biologist. I am a materials stress specialist by training, and I had spent the previous 11 years of my career doing structural integrity assessments of deep space infrastructure components under conditions that included, among other stressors, prolonged radiation exposure. I knew about radiation tolerance the way a person who has spent a decade in that work knows about it, which is practically and specifically, and with an attention to the gap between what documentation says a material can handle and what the material actually does under load. The gap between what the documentation says and what the thing does. The Class 2 median parameters I had come to understand over my 3 months on the platform were derived from a species population that had not spent 4 billion years on a sun-drenched rock learning to absorb and dissipate high-energy radiation. They were organisms that had evolved in gentler radiation environments, under thicker atmospheric shielding, or in contexts where high-energy light was simply not a survival pressure in the same persistent, grinding, unavoidable way it had been on Earth. The Cascade Array emitted coherent light. Coherent light, structured, organized, phase-aligned photons. A laser in the oldest sense of the word that I had grown up with, though the Institute's documentation called it something considerably more elaborate. The array emitted in a frequency range that the documentation described as optimized for biological substrate penetration, which meant frequencies in the range that living tissue absorbs efficiently. Living tissue, in general, absorbs that frequency range efficiently. Human skin, in particular, has been dealing with high-intensity radiation in that general frequency neighborhood since before the species had a name for it, and has spent that entire period building and refining a suite of absorption and dissipation mechanisms that are, by the standards of compact baseline biology, somewhat unusual in their robustness. I finished my tea. I looked at the gas giant. I thought about the footnote that had put me at 80 to 120 milliseconds. Then I went to bed, because the trial was at 8 in the morning and I wanted to be rested. Phase 3 began with the standard pretrial calibration sequence, which took 40 minutes and during which I sat in the preparation bay attached to the primary test floor and allowed Orvith Sass to place sensor pads at 17 points on my body and enter my baseline vital readings into the Institute's monitoring system. Orvith Sass did this efficiently and without small talk, which I appreciated. She was, I had observed over 3 months, a precise professional who did her work well and found unnecessary conversation a friction cost. We got along on that basis. The shield was a curved piece of shaped polymer designed to cover everything except the 7-centimeter exposure window on my forearm. It fit reasonably well. The technician who placed it on me, a Tarvany I had not previously spoken to, very young, whose hands were shaking slightly, adjusted the fit 3 times before Osith Morvine, from the monitoring console, told him quietly that the fit was adequate and to step back. I looked at the exposure window, 7 centimeters square, the inside of my left forearm, which is paler than the outside because I am a woman of mixed Northern European and East African heritage and the melanin distribution on my skin is, as it is for most humans, not uniform. My forearm at the exposure site was at the lighter end of my personal range. I noted this. I did not say anything about it. "Witness Caloran," Osith Morvine said from the console. "Are you ready to begin?" "Yes," I said. "The first exposure will be 2 seconds at 5% of full output. The biosensor array will monitor for tissue response throughout. If you feel any discomfort at any point, say so immediately." "Understood." "The array will engage in 10 seconds. I looked at the focal point indicator on the wall opposite me, which was a small green light that would turn amber when the array was active. It was green. The room was very quiet. The 47 emitter modules hummed at a frequency I could feel in my back teeth. The light turned amber. I felt warmth. Specifically, I felt a warmth that was, if I am honest, not terribly different from the feeling of stepping out of a building on a warm afternoon and having the sun hit your forearm. It was directional. It was focused. It was about 30% more intense than moderate direct sunlight on bare skin, which is the closest comparison I can give. I did not feel pain. After 2 seconds, the array cut off. Orvith Sass read the biosensor output and said, in a tone that was entirely flat, "No tissue response registered." Osith Morvine made a note. "Step to 10%, 2-second exposure." The light turned amber again. The warmth increased. I would say it was now equivalent to strong direct sunlight on a clear summer afternoon at moderate altitude. Still not painful, mildly pleasant if I am being fully accurate. "No tissue response," Orvith Sass said. The pattern continued. At 15%, I noticed the warmth was becoming something I would describe as significant rather than mild, and my forearm surface temperature was clearly elevated. And if I had been sitting in that equivalent of sunlight for a long period, I would eventually have begun to burn. But 2 seconds is 2 seconds. At 20%, Osith Morvine leaned forward at the console and looked at the biosensor display. He said nothing. Orvith Sass said, "No tissue response. Surface temperature elevation of 11 degrees Celsius recorded and dissipating." Osith Morvine looked at me. I looked back at him. He said, "Are you experiencing any discomfort?" "It's warm," I said, "not painful." He looked at his notes. He looked at the biosensor display. He said, in what I can only describe as a carefully neutral tone, continuing to 25%. At 25%, the warmth was, to give it a number, approximately equivalent to pressing your forearm against the outside surface of a coffee mug that has been sitting in direct sunlight for an hour. Warm enough to notice, not warm enough to flinch from. No tissue response. Surface temperature elevation of 19 degrees, dissipating. Osith Morvine had stopped making notes. He was watching the biosensor readout with the focused stillness of a person who has encountered data that does not match any of his models and is waiting to understand what he is looking at. I recognized it as his third mode, the one I had seen twice before, and I noted it. At 30%, Kel wrote something. Orvith Sass read it and turned to look at me with an expression I had not seen on her face in 3 months. It was not alarm exactly. It was more closely the expression of someone who has just opened a cabinet they have opened 1,000 times and found something inside it that was not there before. No tissue response, she said. Surface temperature elevation of 27 degrees dissipating. Dissipating, Osith Morvine said. Yes. In how many seconds? 12 seconds to ambient delta of less than 2 degrees. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Witness Caloran, the Class 2 cell culture substrates at 30% output, the Phase 2 data." "We're at approximately 94 milliseconds," I said. "Yes. We are currently at 2-second exposures. That is 20 times the exposure duration at which the substrates registered full structural compromise." "I know," I said. Another pause, the humming of the emitter modules, the gas giant outside doing whatever gas giants do. Is your forearm, Asith Morvin said, hurting you in any way? No. At all. At all. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, we will continue to 35%. At 35%, I noticed that the skin on my forearm was noticeably warm to my own perception, and if I had been asked to press it against something, I might have said it was mildly uncomfortable, the way it is mildly uncomfortable to hold your hand near a stovetop that is on low. Not painful, not alarming. No tissue response. Surface temperature elevation of 34 degrees, dissipating. 14 seconds to ambient delta of less than 2 degrees. Asith Morvin said very quietly, what is it doing? Orvith Sass said, the biosensor array is reading melanin layer absorption with associated thermal dissipation through the dermis and subcuties. The absorption curve matches the melanin absorption spectrum. The dissipation pathway is consistent with an active heat distribution mechanism, distributed capillary dilation and increased perfusion. The tissue is absorbing the energy and moving the heat. Another silence. It is designed to do this, Asith Morvin said. It was not a question. The mechanism is consistent with a design function, Orvith Sass said carefully. Whether it is designed for this specific frequency range, or whether the frequency overlap is incidental to the mechanism's original purpose, I cannot say from this data. Asith Morvin looked at me. I said nothing. Continue to 40%, he said. 40% was, if I am being precise, the point at which I began to think that an extended exposure would eventually cause discomfort. Not from the intensity of the sensation exactly, but from the cumulative temperature elevation. If the 2-second exposure had been a minute, I think I would have been uncomfortable. But 2 seconds at 40% was approximately equivalent to standing in direct equatorial sunlight with your forearm turned up for a count of 2. Which is something humans do, and have done, and have not historically found to be a medical emergency. No tissue response. Surface temperature elevation of 40 degrees, dissipating in 18 seconds. 40 degrees surface elevation, Asith Morvin said. Yes. The Phase 2 cation substrate at 100% output showed a surface temperature elevation of 61 degrees in the first 100 milliseconds before structural compromise. Yes. And at 40% output, 2-second exposure, the human surface temperature elevation is 40 degrees and the tissue is intact. Yes. Kel wrote something. Orvith Sass read it and said, without inflection, Kel notes that the proportional heat load is not equivalent because the human's absorption mechanism is converting energy to heat more efficiently than the cation substrate's passive absorption. The cation substrate structural compromise was driven by the rate of energy input exceeding the substrate's passive thermal tolerance. The human's mechanism may have a higher effective ceiling because it is not passive. Asith Morvin looked at Kel, then he looked at me, then he looked at the display. The mechanism, he said, is active. The biosensor data is consistent with an active mechanism, yes. An active absorption and dissipation pathway tuned to high-energy radiation input. That is what the data shows. In a species that the pretrial documentation classified as Class 2, median biological parameters. Nobody said anything. I said, it's a melanin response. Humans have a lot of it. We evolved on a planet with direct UV exposure and a variable atmospheric filter. The melanin absorbs high-energy photons and converts them to heat, and the vasculature moves the heat. It's not a special adaptation for laser weapons. It's just what the skin does with high-energy radiation because it has been doing it for a very long time. Asith Morvin looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked back at his console. He said, what does a very long time mean in the context you are using it? The melanin synthesis pathway in hominids is estimated to be somewhere in the range of 1 to 2 million years old. The ultraviolet exposure pressure that's selected for it is approximately 4 billion years old. The room was very quiet. 4 billion years, Asith Morvin said. Earth's sun has been irradiating the surface for approximately 4.5 billion years. Melanin in one form or another appears at the cellular level in organisms much older than hominids. The specific expression in human skin is more recent, but the mechanism itself is not new. Kel wrote something, Orvithsas read it. Her expression was the same one as before, the cabinet-opened expression, but more so. She said, Kel asks whether the human skin's absorption pathway would register as a passive or active mechanism under the cascade array's targeting parameters. I said, I don't know how your targeting parameters classify mechanisms. The array's biological sensitivity targeting protocol identifies active countermeasures, defensive biological responses, and compensates by increasing output until the countermeasure is overwhelmed. It was designed to address the concern that some species might have evolved specific responses to directed energy input. All right, I said. If the melanin pathway registers as an active mechanism, the array's compensatory protocol would step up output faster and higher than the calibration trial's manual sequence. I thought about that. What's the ceiling on the compensatory protocol? Full output. And the array's full output, I said, would do what to my forearm at your current understanding of my tissue response parameters? Orvithsas looked at Asith Morvin. Asith Morvin looked at the display. He said, we do not currently know. The pre-trial model put you at 80 to 120 milliseconds at full output. The data from the current trial suggests the pre-trial model significantly underestimated your tissue tolerance. We would need to continue the step sequence to establish a revised ceiling, if one exists within the array's output range. Within the output range, meaning you're not sure you can reach it, I said. Asith Morvin did not answer immediately. Then he said very precisely, we are not sure. I looked at my forearm. The skin at the exposure site was slightly pink. It was the pink of mild sun exposure, the kind that is not a burn, the kind that fades in a few hours, the kind that is so unremarkable on a human body that most humans have never thought about what it represents in terms of absorbed and dissipated energy. I had not thought about it in that way until 3 months on a weapons research platform, with a foot-thick documentation file on biological substrate compromise, had given me occasion to think about it differently. I said, I would like to see the compensatory protocol documentation before we discuss continuing. Asith Morvin said, of course. He gestured to Orvithsas, who brought up the protocol file on a secondary display and turned it toward me. I read it. It was not long. The compensatory protocol was a feedback-driven automatic step-up sequence that would increase output at a rate proportional to the estimated remaining tolerance margin of the target's active defensive response, with a cap at whatever the operator had set as the session's maximum. For the Phase 3 trial, the operator set maximum was 100% of full output. I read that and I thought about it, and I thought about the 4 billion year history of melanin, and I thought about the compensatory protocol's automatic step-up rate, which was designed to overwhelm active defensive responses before they could fully engage. If the compensatory protocol activates, I said, and my melanin pathway registers as an active mechanism, the array will step up faster than the manual sequence we've been running. Yes. And it will step up to whatever margin the feedback calculation determines is necessary to overwhelm the mechanism. Yes. Has the compensatory protocol ever failed to overwhelm a target's active defensive response? Asith Morvin looked at his notes. He looked at the display. He said, no. The protocol was validated against the full range of known biological active response mechanisms in the compact species database. I said, "Is humanity in the compact species database?" A pause. "You are listed as Class 2 median with a note to supplementary B7, Orvith said, which does not include an empirically derived melanin absorption curve." No. So the compensatory protocol's validation set does not include actual empirical data on the human melanin response. No, Morvin said, it does not. I thought about what it would look like if the compensatory protocol activated against a mechanism it had not been validated against, a mechanism that was several orders of magnitude older and more specifically radiation adapted than anything in the validation set, a mechanism that the protocol's feedback calculation had never been tested against, and that had just absorbed 40% of the array's full output over 2 seconds without registering a tissue response. I thought about what "overwhelm the mechanism" meant in operational terms. I thought about the fact that the compensatory protocol would step up to full output if necessary. I thought about the fact that nobody in this room currently knew where the human melanin response's ceiling was, or whether the ceiling was inside the array's output range at all. I said, "I think we should suspend Phase 3. Morvin looked at me. His expression was not offended, which I had been mildly concerned it might be. It was the expression of a very careful scientist who has just been handed a data point that changes everything he thought he understood about his experiment, and who knows it. "Yes," he said, "I think we should." What followed was not a single event but a process, and the process took 7 months. I did not go home. Morvin requested and received an extension of my posting, which I was asked whether I consented to and which I did consent to, because I was genuinely interested in the outcome, and also because someone needed to be the measuring instrument and I was already there. The platform's administrative system handled my posting extension with a minimum of friction. Though there was a form to fill, there is always a form to fill, and the form required a reason category that did not include "Your weapons system did not perform as expected against my forearm." I listed the reason as "ongoing calibration requirements." This was accurate. Morvin spent 3 days after Phase 3 reviewing the data before he came to find me. I was in the documentation library when he appeared at the entry, a Varethian of late middle age by his species standards, long-limbed and deliberate in his movements, carrying a notation tablet that I had never seen him carry to the library before. He sat across from me at the study table without being invited, which was the first time in 3 months he had approached me in an informal context, and he set the tablet face down and looked at the table surface for a moment. Then he said, "I am going to need to revise the pretrial model substantially. To do that revision correctly, I need empirical data that does not currently exist. You are the only source for that data." "I know," I said. "The trials I am proposing will be more extensive than Phase 3. Longer exposures, more measurement points, a broader frequency range. The modified protocol will not use the compensatory step-up sequence. Every exposure will be manual, with full operator control, and the session maximum will be set to the exposure level at which the biosensors first register a genuine stress response in the tissue. Not structural compromise, not surface temperature that exceeds safe parameters, but the earliest detectable indication that the mechanism is approaching a ceiling." "That's a reasonable protocol," I said. "It may take months to establish the full curve." "I have time," I said. He looked at me for a moment with the expression that I had come to understand meant he was weighing something he had not yet decided to say. Then he said, "You understood what the Phase 3 data meant before I did." "I had been thinking about the footnote for 3 months," I said. "You had a model that worked for everything else. I had a reason to think specifically about why it might not work for me." He nodded once and picked up the tablet, and that was the end of the conversation. But from that point on, the working relationship between us shifted in a way that I noticed, and that he did not explicitly acknowledge, and that I think we both preferred to leave unacknowledged. He had been running an experiment. The experiment had produced a result he had not anticipated. He was now running a different experiment, and I was not only the instrument but, in some meaningful sense, a collaborator in the design. We ran modified trials, not the cascade array at high output. The compensatory protocol question was never resolved to Osith Morvin's satisfaction as a safety matter, and so the array stayed at graduated manual sequence with explicit protocol overrides preventing automatic step-up. We ran longer exposures at lower output levels. We ran spectroscopic analysis of my skin's absorption curve across the frequency range the array used and several adjacent ranges. We ran comparative analysis against the existing compact species database and against a supplementary dataset Osith Morvin, assembled by requesting biological samples from 3 human volunteers who were stationed at other compact facilities, which he obtained through channels that involved a great deal of documentation and took 11 weeks. The 3 human volunteers whose samples Osith Morvin requested were, as far as I could determine from the anonymized dataset, a compact dockyard engineer of West African heritage, a xenobiological liaison officer of Central Asian heritage, and a retired infrastructure specialist whose ancestry I could not determine, but who had apparently worked for 30 years in high UV environments and whose melanin expression was, according to the spectroscopic data, at the upper range of what I had encountered in the literature. The 3 of them had never met each other and never knew they were part of the same dataset. Their melanin absorption curves, compared against mine, showed a range that confirmed what Osith Morvin and I had suspected. The mechanism was not anomalous. It was consistent across human subjects with varying melanin concentrations, varying heritages, varying sun exposure histories. The curve shifted. The threshold varied. But the fundamental architecture of the response, absorb, convert, dissipate, maintain, was present in all 4 of us. The mechanism was not a personal outlier. It was a species feature. Osith Morvin received the supplementary data on a Tuesday morning and spent until Thursday afternoon running it against the revised model. When he emerged from his office on Thursday evening, he went directly to the secondary monitoring lab and found me there. I had been running a calibration sequence and staying late to review the spectroscopic output. And he stood in the doorway for a moment and then said, "The variance across the 4 human samples is within 7% at the melanin absorption peak and 11% at the dissipation rate. That is a narrower variance than I observe across the Tarvini or the Varethian species baseline datasets." "Consistent architecture," I said. "Yes," he was quiet. "The mechanism did not evolve once in your lineage. It did not appear as a recent novelty. It is deeply conserved, which means it has been selected for over a very long time." "Yes," I said, "because the pressure that selected for it has been consistently present." "Yes," I said. He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he went back to his office, and I went back to the spectroscopic data, and we did not discuss it again that evening. But I thought about it on the walk back to my quarters, under the platform's artificial lighting, with the gas giant's bands of cloud visible through the corridor's viewport. And I thought about what it meant to be a species so thoroughly shaped by a single persistent pressure that the shaping had become invisible, had become simply the baseline, had become the unremarkable fact of what skin is and what it does. During those 11 weeks of waiting for the supplementary samples, I continued my calibration duties, and I continued reading the documentation library, and I had several long conversations with Orvith Sass that were ostensibly about calibration methodology, but were, underneath the methodology, about something else. Orvith Sass was precise, and precise people, I have found, are often more willing than imprecise ones to admit when a model is wrong. The model said class 2 median. The data said something significantly different. Orvith Sass was working through the gap between those two things with the careful attention of someone who takes it personally when a classification fails to describe the thing it is classifying. "The problem," she said to me, on an evening about 6 weeks into the extended posting, when we were both still in the secondary monitoring lab, because the day's data run had thrown a result she wanted to understand before she slept on it, "is not the classification system. The system works correctly for every other entry in the database." "I know," I said. "The problem is the baseline assumption. The assumption that a species classified as Class 2 by the standard morphological and metabolic indices would fall within the Class 2 median radiation response parameters. The assumption is reasonable given the data available," I said. "There wasn't anything in the compact's 11 years of human contact data that would have flagged the melanin response as an outlier. We don't spend a lot of time in UV-range directed energy fields under compact conditions." "No," she said, "the selection pressure was absent from the observation window." She was quiet for a moment. "Kell said something when we were reviewing the Phase 3 data. He said the error was not methodological, it was historical. The database could not have contained information about 4 billion years of selection pressure. The database is 11 years old." "Yes," I said. 11 years, she said, against 4 billion. She said it the way Osith Morvine had said it in the test bay, as a repetition, as a way of sitting with a number that was too large to immediately understand. I had heard that repetition a lot in my time on the platform. I had learned to let it finish on its own. What we found, and I am summarizing here what took Osith Morvine and Orvith Sass another 8 months after my posting ended to write up properly, was not that human skin was impervious to directed coherent light weapons. It was not. At sufficient output and sufficient duration, the human melanin response would saturate, and the tissue would sustain damage, the same as any biological substrate. What we found was that the saturation threshold was substantially higher than anything the pretrial model had assumed. The energy dissipation rate was substantially faster than any mechanism in the existing validation dataset, and the effective tolerance margin against the cascade array's frequency output specifically. Not all frequencies, not all output types, specifically this frequency range, which was, by considerable coincidence, well within the UV-adjacent spectrum that 4 billion years of solar radiation had been selecting for melanin adaptation against, was not 80 to 120 milliseconds. The revised estimate, which Osith Morvine's paper was careful to describe as an estimate pending further controlled trial data, was in the range of 40 to 60 seconds at full output for the specific frequency configuration used in the cascade trials. Not milliseconds. Seconds. The cascade array, optimized to exploit the frequency range most efficiently absorbed by biological tissue, had been optimized entirely by the coincidence of physics and evolutionary history, against the frequency range that Earth's sun had been irradiating us with for longer than the planet had had oxygen in its atmosphere, the range that had driven the development of the most robust and specifically adapted radiation management system in the compact species database, the range that we had spent so much time and biological energy learning to handle that by the time someone pointed a very expensive weapons system at us and fired it, all it did was make us warm. Osith Morvine's paper, when it was eventually published, had a section in the discussion titled Implications for Directed Energy Weapons Design Against Human Subjects that ran to 4 pages. The section's conclusion, in language that I read 3 times because I wanted to make sure I was reading it correctly, stated that the cascade illumination system as configured was contraindicated for use against human targets in any scenario where extended engagement duration was a possibility, and recommended that any future directed energy weapons design intended for multi-species deployment contexts Either incorporate frequency adaptability to shift away from the melanin absorption peak during human target engagement, or account for a target dwell time on the order of tens of seconds rather than milliseconds when calculating engagement parameters. Tens of seconds to achieve what the same system achieved against other compact species in under 400 milliseconds. The paper also had a two-paragraph section, more quietly worded, about what this implied for the Class II median classification as applied to humans, and about the gap between the documentation and the thing the documentation was supposed to describe. I did not write any of that paper. I was a calibration witness, not a co-author, but Asif Morvin did something that I think of as one of the more quietly generous acts of scientific communication I have encountered. He put my name in the acknowledgments, and he described me there as the material whose behavior prompted a revision of the model. I thought that was accurate. I was back on Earth for 3 months before the paper was circulated in the Institute's pre-publication review process, and I read the pre-publication draft in the kitchen of the apartment I had rented in Nairobi while I was between postings, on a late afternoon when the sun was coming through the window and landing on my forearm where it rested on the table. I sat there for a while after I finished reading, looking at my arm in the afternoon light, at the brown of the skin, at the particular texture of it, at the evidence of approximately 4 billion years of solar radiation management written into the biology below the surface. It is easy, reading about your own species from outside, to conclude that humans are unremarkable. We are, in most of the standard metrics the compact uses, moderate, medium height range for bipedal species, medium neurological complexity by some measures, medium lifespan, medium environmental tolerance, medium, the word that had appeared in my head when I first read Supplementary Note B7 and had not fully left since. But medium is a description of the mean. It says nothing about the distribution. It says nothing about the tails. It says nothing about what happens when you take a species that has been surviving in the specific conditions of a specific planet for a specific duration, and you put them in a testing environment that happens to replicate one of the most persistent selection pressures from that planet's history, and you measure what happens. What happens is you get a number that is 400 times larger than the model predicted, and the model was not wrong, exactly. The model was just built on a dataset that did not include 4 billion years. I put the draft down. I looked at the sun on my arm. I thought about melanin, and I thought about the compensatory protocol, and I thought about Asif Morvin's face when the biosensors had read 40 degrees surface elevation, and dissipating for the 5th time, that expression of a person whose model has run into a material it was not designed to describe. I thought about the first time I had stood outside on Earth as a child, at the beach in Mombasa in December, my mother's hand on my shoulder, and the Indian Ocean going on forever in front of me, the sun coming down hard and flat and warm, and me thinking nothing in particular about it because it was just the sun and I had always been in it, and the skin that absorbed it had always been mine, and there was nothing remarkable about any of it. Nothing remarkable. That is the thing. That has always been the thing. You do not know what you are made of until something outside the frame you grew up in tries to measure it and finds out its instruments do not go that high. The sun moved across the kitchen window. My arm stayed warm. Outside, somewhere in orbit, a very expensive weapons array was sitting in its maintenance configuration, pending a design review that was going to take at least 2 years and result in a significant retooling of its frequency selection logic. The Compact Security Council had received a preliminary briefing. The Cascade Illumination Program's development timeline had been extended by an indefinite period pending the outcome of the frequency adaptability assessment. Someone who had signed off on the original specification, somewhere in the research administration chain, was having a difficult year. None of that was my concern. My concern had been the forearm, and the forearm had been fine, and the data from it had gone into a paper that would revise the model, and that was enough. I picked up the draft and read the acknowledgement section again. The material whose behavior prompted a revision of the model. I thought that was about right. I set the paper down and I got up and made tea, and I stood at the window looking out at the ocean of rooftops below, at the warm late afternoon sky, at the light that was not hurting me, had never hurt me, was not going to hurt me, was in fact simply doing what light has always done when it touches this particular kind of skin on this particular kind of world, getting absorbed and turned to warmth and moved on.